good evening or good afternoon for you, but good morning for me. So as Pat said, I'm going to be talking today about an area of research that I'm quite interested in, which is global Englishes. Actually, a lot of what I look at in my work is at the kind of intersection of globalization and language education and language learning. And so I think the effect of globalization affects a lot of us, particularly when it comes to language learning, because often we're learning languages to communicate with people, beyond our local communities, or sometimes within our local communities as they become more multilingual. So I've broken the presentation today into three parts. So the first part, I'm going to look at the global growth of English and just look at, well, what's the current situation of the English language and how it's used around the world. Then I'm going to look at global approaches to language teaching, sometimes what we refer to as global English's language teaching, or some people refer to as teaching English as an international language. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That will be the bulk of my talk. And then at the end, I'm going to look at future innovations about what this might mean if we are teaching or learning English in the 21st century and in the future. So first of all, let's just have a look at the global growth of English. One of the first kind of pieces of information that I want to communicate from the beginning is that the language is always changing, and English is not unique. Okay, we can see the same thing in all languages. We will see the same thing in the Thai language. Probably your grandmother will say things like, nobody speaks Thai correctly anymore. Young people are always making mistakes with the Thai language. We see this in all languages, including English, where the language is constantly evolving and changing as new generations speak it. And so here we have an example of how the English language has evolved over 1,000 years. So if we look at 900 AD, so more than 1,000 years ago, it's not recognizable as English today, right? I think even if we try to be creative, we cannot even see, the English language in this version of Old English. If we jump 500 years, okay, to 1400 AD, it starts to look a little bit familiar, right? We can start to recognize some vocabulary. Some of the spelling looks a little bit different, but it's recognizable as the English language. And then if we jump to 1900 AD, we see modern English being used today. So this is just an example of how language is evolving. And I think it's important to understand why it's evolving. Language evolves naturally as speakers use it, and they need to adapt it for new needs. As we have new experiences, we need new vocabularies, new technological innovations require new vocabulary. But what we're seeing here is much more than that kind of natural evolution of language. We're seeing language really change drastically. And the reason for this is what happens when the language becomes in contact with another language. And so when languages become in contact with each other, languages are in contact with each other, we sometimes see rapid change as new kind of language features, not just vocabulary, but grammatical features are borrowed. And so one of the biggest changes for English between 900 AD and 1400 AD was because there was a big French influence on English, and it changed the language dramatically. Now, why is this important? It's important to realize that language change can be substantial or small. It can be sudden or gradual. It can happen on one occasion or be incremental. But sudden substantial change requires quite intense contact. So when speakers of different languages have intense contact with each other, we see greater change. Light contact might just be vocabulary borrowing. So what we see then is features of the language, such as the vocabulary and the sound of the language can occur through light contact, but something like syntax, okay, the grammar of a language requires kind of intense contact. And I think we can see this in everyday life. Maybe if you go on exchange to Australia for 6 months or 1 year. You know, you imagine you're an exchange student in Australia. You're probably quite quickly going to adopt the vocabulary and maybe even some features of the Australian accent, because you will have this kind of contact. And so this would be an example of a kind of elements of language that are quite easy to change. What is happening these days, and what we're going to talk about, is how English has spread and the kinds of changes that have happened to English as a result of that spread. So in some of my past work into global Englishes, we look at 4 different ways. We refer to them as channels, but they're 4 different ways that English has spread around the world. The first way was through settler colonization. And so this meant that English-speaking people in England, the UK, moved to other parts of the world and settled there and started new colonies, new cities, new towns. And so an example of this would be the spread of English to Australia via convict settlements and through, farming settlements. And so new types of English emerged because of this. And we saw a kind of Australian version of English slowly evolve over time. The second channel was through the kind of dark history of colonialism by slavery, where slaves were displaced that spoke very different languages in different parts of Africa and taken to slave plantations in, for example, places like Jamaica. And suddenly those speakers had to use English as a lingua franca to communicate because they spoke very different languages. So quite rapidly then we saw new types of English emerge in places like Jamaica. The third way English spread was through trade and exploitation colonies. And so this was also through colonialism, where, for example, England had a lot of contact with important trade countries like India and Singapore that they wanted to exploit for their own economic gain. And then we saw English spread to places like Hong Kong, to Singapore, to India, to Pakistan, to a lot of African nations like Nigeria as well. And finally, the fourth one was through globalization. And we've seen, this is the kind of big one that we're seeing most of English kind of spread around the world today. And so this might result in English spreading to places that had little historical contact with the country or only had light contact previously. So an example of this would be the spread of English to students in Sweden, or indeed the spread of English to Thailand. So what we see then is different types of linguistic processes that cause the English language to change. So channel 1, we saw new Englishes, new native Englishes emerge. So these were like Australian English, Canadian English, different types of American English, and so forth. Channel 2 also saw native Englishes emerge, right? When you go to places like Jamaica, they speak English as a native language, but the linguistic process was different. It was called something like creolization, which basically means when 2 languages start to mix and a Creole is formed, which is a kind of a mix between 2 languages, but then that slowly becomes more standardized in the education system. In channel 3, we see nativized Englishes emerge. And so a good example of this would be in places like India and Singapore, where English has become very prominently used within the education systems, particularly in Singapore, to the point that it's the main medium of instruction. And finally, channel 4, through globalizations, sees a lot of learned Englishes. So people are learning English. And it's this final one where we're seeing rapid growth in the English language through globalization. And so this is the kind of tricky one, right? Because if Englishes are learned in the classroom, then we start to have to ask questions about, well, what type of English do we teach if English is so varied around the world today? So when I talk about why globalization is important, I think it can be quite useful to look at how that has occurred over time. And so here we have a graph of 100 years where we see some the number of speakers of some major world languages in terms of those who speak it as a native or first language. And so if we see a language like Arabic, and here we are now in 2023, where that red line is. If we look at Arabic, we can see quite a rapid increase in speakers of Arabic as a native language, particularly in the last 100 years. If we look at French, it's also increasing, but more gradually. If we look at Spanish, it's very similar to French. If we look at English, actually, it's not that different from Spanish and French also. We're just seeing a kind of natural, steady increase. We're missing one major language here, right? A big one that people speak as a main language, and that is Mandarin Chinese. And so if we look at Mandarin Chinese, it's off the chart. We have a lot of speakers of this as a native language. So then what's remarkable about English if there are more native speakers of Chinese than English? It's because actually the growth and use of English as a global language is not driven by native speakers, okay? It's those who are using English as a foreign language, an additional language, a second language, whatever you call it, that make up the world majority today. And in order to capture them on the graph, we need to shrink the scale. And it looks something like this. So once again, here we are now. What we're seeing now is actually, we're only just in the very beginning of kind of rapid growth of English language learners around the world. And a lot of these statistics, which were put together by a person called David Graddle in 2014, these are based on projected numbers based on who is learning English in the educational systems around the world. And I think we all know that English, a lot of governments now are really pushing English language, not only in university, but high school, through primary school, sometimes even younger. And if these trends continue, we're going to see this huge growth in English language users in the future. And so it's these speakers of English as a lingua franca that are really driving growth. So here's another chart. These numbers are actually from 2022. So these are kind of numbers now that have been put together from 2022. And what we have in the blue are so-called mother tongue speakers or native speakers or L1 speakers. And in the red, we have what we call lingua franca speakers. So these are people that speak English in addition to another language. They're using it to communicate with speakers of different first languages. So it's the lingua franca speakers actually that are the majority population, okay, by far. You can see how much bigger the red part of this chart is to the blue part. And this is the ratio of kind of native English speakers to lingua franca speakers. Of course, it's very difficult to predict, and put an exact number on it. But I think these are actually very conservative estimates where they're judging lingua franca speakers as people who can actually use the language for some elements of communication. I think if we look at all English language learners, this number would be even bigger. So what we're happening now is we're seeing a global and multilingual world where it's estimated that only 4% of the English conversations in the world today involve only native speakers. And I find this number startling. So that means 96% of the English language conversations today it could involve two lingua franca speakers or a lingua franca speaker speaking to a native speaker. So what's driving, what is the majority is actually English as a lingua franca and not English as a native language. So then what does this mean in terms of language education? I think what cannot be denied is what is taught in the traditional ELT classroom is very different to how the language is being used outside of the classroom. And so what we might need to do then is to make sure that we are preparing English language users to use English in this lingua franca format, right? That we're not just preparing them to use a kind of American English to speak to Americans or British English to speak to British people, because that's not the world majority. And that's not the the more than 96% of how English is being used in the world today. And so that's the main focus of what I want to talk to you about today. So Kirkpatrick, who has done quite a lot of work in Hong Kong, said this global growth of English has implication for language learning goals, for language teachers, and for the curriculum. Matsuda and Friedrich say the linguistic, cultural, and functional diversity associated with English today challenges some of the fundamental assumptions of English language teaching and requires that we revisit our pedagogical practices. And so then this moves us to the second part of the presentation today, which is looking at, well, what does this mean in terms of English language teaching and English language learning? So first of all, before we go further, if we're going to talk about global Englishes and language teaching, we should better understand, what do I mean by global Englishes? So global Englishes includes work from three main areas. The first one is world Englishes. And world Englishes was one of the first fields to kind of pluralize English. So say Englishes instead of English. And the reason for saying Englishes is to emphasize that the English language is multiple. Okay, it's plural, it comes in many forms. It's not just one single standard language. And so world Englishes was very influential in identifying and codifying regional varieties of English. So a lot of research involved kind of identifying, well, what are the features of Singaporean English or Indian English or Australian English or Filipino English. And the reasons for this was to just kind of show that lots of different varieties of English were very legitimately used and standard in their own contexts. And so global Englishes builds on this work. It also builds on the work of English as a lingua franca. So English as a lingua franca examines English use within and across borders. So while world Englishes might be interested in, say, Singaporean English, English as a lingua franca is more interested in what happens when a speaker of Singaporean English speaks to somebody in Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam. And everybody uses English as a lingua franca to fulfill to take part in a conversation. And so English as a lingua franca is quite interested in this particular aspect. It also incorporates the work of English as an international language. So English as an international language was kind of a more popular term that grew out of language education in North America, and kind of acknowledged that in a kind of more mobile world, what kind of English should we be teaching? And so I would say English as an international language is quite similar to English as a lingua franca, but the kind of focus was a little bit different. English as an international language was the kind of popular term in North America in language education, people studying TESOL or language education. English as a lingua franca was more of a linguistic term that was very popular in Europe, because Europe was very mobile and multilingual. And so it really looked first at English as a kind of European lingua franca. And so all of these fields then, I capture under the label of global Englishes. And so it's supposed to kind of include a kind of wide variety of research that looks at how English is used in the world today. And particularly, I'm interested in teaching implications for this. So all of those three fields have a similar underlying ideology. So all fields would view English as plural. They would focus on English by non-native speakers or speakers as a lingua franca. They all focus on the global ownership of the language. So they see English as, owned by the globe and used by the globe now, and not necessarily the property of the UK or, the US or other native speaking countries. They help inform the sociolinguistic challenges of a globalized world, and they have implications for English language teaching. And it's this last one that I want to focus on for this part of the presentation. So as Pat mentioned in my introduction, yes, I've written quite a lot on this topic. And so here's one of the books that I've written with my colleague, Nicola Galloway. And so actually a lot of what I'm talking to you about today is from the work that I've been doing with Nicola Galloway. So Nicola Galloway was somebody who I taught English with in Japan for several years. And so a lot of the research that we did was very classroom-based research during that time in Japan. And so a lot of the kind of our interests really grew from teaching programs in Japan. So for example, one of the universities that I worked at Japan was with English majors. So I understand many people in the audience today are English majors. We were also working with English majors. And it was at a university that a lot of the graduates wanted to go into areas of tourism. Or work, at Tokyo Airport, Narita Airport. They wanted these kinds of jobs. Actually, the university was very close to Disneyland, so some people aspired to get jobs there as well. But the point being that our students were going to be using English as a lingua franca in the future, right? They were going to use it in tourism to communicate with people from China, from Thailand, from Korea, from Germany, all around the world. And so because of this, then we changed the curriculum and tried to teach English, not as a kind of standard American English, which was very popular in Japan, but actually trying to do things to teach English as an international language. So that was one university I worked at in Japan. The other one was at business. So I worked in a business school in Japan, where the students were going to use English for business in the future. And so we also thought for those particular learners, they were also going to be doing business a lot with other countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so global English was very important for them. So, a lot of the work has come from that, but actually you'll see a lot of really, really good work emerging out of Asia. And so I've included one book here that has covered, Southeast Asia and China, Japan, by Gabrielle Fan Fung and Widodo. And they really look at critical perspectives of global Englishes in Asia, which is really good. And actually a lot of really interesting research on global Englishes is coming out of Thailand at the moment. So you seem to have some very active scholars there. So while I'm talking about global English as language teaching, I want you to understand that sometimes different words are used to describe the same thing. And so some people might use this term called World Englishes Informed ELT. So this is the WE, Informed ELT, World Englishes Informed ELT. Some people might refer to teaching English as an international language. Other scholars might say English as a lingua franca aware pedagogy, whereas the term that I've often used is global English as language teaching. What I want to emphasize here is that all of these labels are being used to talk about the same thing. And so I think it doesn't really matter if you want to use teaching English as an international language or world English as informed ELT or global English as language teaching, the labels don't matter. What matters is the central message. And that message is that we need to innovate and change English language education to prepare learners to use English as a global language. So when we say which term is best, I wouldn't say one term is better than the other, right? I think all of them are trying to communicate the same kind of message. Each of these different names indicate a different intellectual history and affiliation, but they are more similar than different in their assumptions, visions, and suggested practices. And so this is a quote from Aya Matsuda, which I would agree with. I think yes, the labels come from different kind of fields of research, but actually the central vision and their messages about changing practice are much more similar to each other. And so sometimes then other people will just use this term teaching English as an international language to refer to the same thing. And I might argue actually teaching English as an international language might be a more kind of transparent and clear label, because it's quite easy for people to understand what's meant by that. So sometimes I will use, this term quite regularly too. So if we're looking at, well, what needs to change in terms of classroom practices, we've put forward several proposals for change. One is to increase world Englishes and English as a lingua franca exposure in the ELT classroom, in the ELT curricula. So basically saying we need to expose students to many more accents, many more different varieties of English in the classroom to better prepare them. And second proposal would be to emphasize respect for multilingualism. So communicating to students that multilingualism is normal in the world today, because the majority of people, English language speakers, are multilingual. They're using English in addition to their own native language, but sometimes other languages as well. We see a proposal for change to raise awareness of global Englishes, so talk to our students directly about how English is used in the world today, so that they can kind of better understand how they're going to use English after they graduate from school or from university. We see a need to raise awareness of English as a lingua franca strategies. And so if we can imagine what I mean by English as a lingua franca strategies is that perhaps students need to develop certain communication skills and strategies to communicate effectively with English as a lingua franca. And so some of these strategies could be, well, what skills are needed or strategies are needed if you're communicating with somebody who has a higher proficiency than you? Or what if you're communicating with somebody that has a lower proficiency than you? Do you have the strategies to adapt your language? What happens if somebody is using different vocabulary to describe words that are different from your vocabulary? Do you have the skills or strategies to compensate for that? Or what happens when you are communicating with somebody and you're finding it very difficult to understand their accent, or they're having difficulty understanding your accent? Do you have strategies to adapt and make sure communication is successful? The fifth proposal would be to emphasize respect for diverse English using cultures, and I'll explain what I mean by that soon. And then also we see a need to change teaching hiring practices so that we are making use of all language teachers and not prioritizing or elevating the role of the so-called native English speaker. So let's go through each of these one by one. So first of all, in terms of increasing world Englishes and English as a lingua franca, English as a lingua franca exposure in ELT classrooms, we have a problem in a lot of English language classrooms today, in that if you open a textbook or if you listen to audio material that are used in English language classes, almost always we are seeing, general American as a standard, or British English as a standard in both written and audio materials, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of what's taught. What we see then is a bit of an issue, that often the type of accent, the British accent that is used, is called RP, or received pronunciation. Or sometimes it's referred to as the kind of BBC English. We have a problem in that received pronunciation, or RP, is only spoken by about 3 to 6% of the UK population. So even if a student masters, is only exposed to RP, and even if they travel to the UK to use English, the majority of people don't speak with that accent. And so it's not going to prepare them to really use English as a global language. It's not even going to prepare them to use English within the UK, because it's a minority. General American is also not a single standard, and we can see that the kinds of American English really varies from state to state and region to region in America as well. So what we have is that students need English for global usage and not merely for communication with native speakers of these standards. Saraceni would say to support the notion of standard English is incompatible with the complex reality of how English is used worldwide. And I should emphasize here, when we're talking about which English or the norms, I'm really talking about spoken English, where we see a lot of different variation in terms of the English is used for communication. One could argue for written English, or particularly written academic English, there is more of a standard, right? That there does tend to be, written English does tend to be more standardized. But certainly in terms of spoken communication, I think we're not really preparing our students if we only teach them American or British English. And so here we see a map of the UK with all of the different types of accents that are used across even the UK. So a global English approach argues exposure to diversity of English is essential. And so this is essential to be able to communicate successfully with people all over the globe. And so students need to comprehend different varieties so they're better prepared to deal with English interactions in international contexts. And so here we see an example, just a bit of a fun example in the picture of a miscommunication between an American and an Australian English speaker because of pronunciation differences. And so, we want to try to avoid these kinds of communication breakdowns and ensure that we're prepared to kind of adapt to using English as a lingua franca, that we're familiar with lots of different types of accents. So what does this look like in the classroom? One of the early studies that I did with Nicola Galloway in Japan was in our classes, we used a listening journal to explode, sorry, this word should be to expose students to a range of accents. So what we mean by a listening journal was that the students, for a homework task, were required to find and listen to 10 different speakers of English around the world. We gave them access to different samples that they could listen to that were about 10 minutes long, that were sitting in the library, that they could go to the library and listen to them. But they could also look, on YouTube or other sources, news sources, to find their own if they wanted to. And so they had to listen to a different speaker of English and then record in a journal, what type of English they listened to, a little bit about the context, and then just reflect on any features they noticed about it, what they thought about it. We also used a presentation task as a separate activity to have students research a variety of English and present it in small groups. And so you can see some pictures on the slides of them doing a presentation. Other examples of this have included work in Hong Kong, so where Matthew Sung encouraged his class to seek out and engage in English as a lingua franca communication for a homework assignment. So go out and talk to tourists or people in Hong Kong, and then reflect on the kinds of communications that they had outside of the classroom. We're also seeing a lot more research recently, and a lot of it actually is emerging within that Asian context. So we see work by Lee in Korea, where Lee used recorded interviews and with students that went to a film festival, and they interviewed different international tourists at the film festival to find out what they thought about different movies, and then made that into a project. We've seen a study in, I think, Turkey, where people used WhatsApp for dialect awareness training with 58 pre-service English language teachers, and Bunsok et al. And last year, so sorry, this is no longer in press, but actually, Bunsok in Thailand has been doing a lot of work recently. Actually, there's quite a number of studies that he and his colleagues have been involved in, where a team of researchers in Thailand have been experimenting with things like online films and other digital media as a means to expose students to different varieties of English, which are quite innovative and interesting. So that's what I mean by the first proposal. The next two I want to take together because they are both, so number 2 and number 5 are talking about multilingualism and multiculturalism. So I want to talk about these two in the same space. So the first one about emphasizing respect for multilingualism. So what we see now is the world is really moving away, and English language teaching is moving away from this notion of monolingualism that, you know, we are basically sometimes in the language classrooms, we are creating or emphasizing monolingualism through kind of focusing on English-only pedagogy. This notion that English is only used with English and not used alongside other languages. Whereas multilingualism might say that we can use students' first language for certain functions in teaching and in the classrooms and in life. We also are kind of shifting the goals that maybe the goal of English language learners today shouldn't be to sound native-like, okay? To be a competent speaker of English, you do not need to sound like a native speaker. You do not need to mimic an American accent or a British accent. The goal is that you should be a multi-competent speaker, that as long as you can function and use English for the purposes that you want, then that is fulfilling your goal. And that is a much more realistic goal. And also we're seeing a shift in terms of teachers. In that I think we need to value multilingual teachers much, much more than monolingual teachers. And if we think about it, it's quite strange. To give you an example is in Japan, when I taught in Japan, and I'm sure this might be the same in Thailand, that, you know, some jobs are held by monolingual native English speakers. And so this could be, for an example, an American teacher going to Japan to teach English. They can get a really good job as an English language teacher, but they're monolingual, okay? That American teacher has never studied or mastered a foreign language before. I find it quite strange that you can be considered an expert in language teaching when you have never learned a language yourself, okay? And so I think there's something broken with the system if we really value this, that we need to value more multilingual teachers. So those that can use English alongside other languages that really understand the language learning process. I think those sorts of teachers can be far more valuable and really good role models for students. So in terms of multilingualism in the classroom, this is not new. Actually, for decades, we have been focusing on the fact that, you know, using students' first language for certain functions or effects in the classroom can be quite positive. You know, it can have quite a good effect. For example, when building rapport with students, explaining homework, explaining complicated grammar functions, it can be quite useful compared to this kind of English-only teaching. So Ferguson suggests the L1 serves as a communicative and pedagogical resource in bilingual contexts, especially when pupils struggle to understand difficult subject matter. So that's multilingualism. So next, let's look at the next one of multiculturalism. And I think here on this page, I represent, I think, another problem in the English language and some traditional English language classrooms. So often when we open up English language textbooks, we will see pages like this, okay, learning about British history, learning about a day in the life of the USA, learning about festivals in Australia. And it's this notion that these textbooks are communicating the fact that English equals Britain or English equals America, and that you are only using the English language to use in Britain or America, that these are kind of English using communities. And so I think it's not only these, but sometimes there are various activities that are very culturally embedded in what's culturally interesting or important in British or American culture. And so here's an example of, a textbook that's teaching real English because it's teaching the real English that British people use, young British people use. So if we go back and think about that most English use, so 96% of English use around the world does not involve only native speakers, then how can we say that this is the real English, right, when it's in the minority? So a global Englisher sees a need to move away from these kind of multicultural norms to look at communicative practices of multilingual and multicultural speakers. So they want to view culture as a fluid concept. What I mean by this is, it's this notion that we need to better communicate to students that English is not tied to America, it's not tied to Britain, it's not tied to Australia or New Zealand. Like, yes, these are just some cultures that use English. But you can go to Vietnam, you can go to Malaysia, you can step out your door in Thailand, and you can find English using cultures and communities, right? That actually are globally, we're seeing an English using culture. And so these kinds of messages, I think, are kind of too outdated and need to be better updated to really communicate the kind of cultural communities that use English. So here's an example from Germany, actually, which highlights one of the problems. So one of my doctoral students previously, actually this was her master's work, but she examined 4 high school upper intermediate textbooks in one state in Germany, which is the most populous state. She chose this because that state curriculum said their goal was to teach German students to use English as a European lingua franca. So that was the main goal, and they produced textbooks for this. And so she analyzed the textbooks to see, well, what kinds of English, what kinds of cultures are being presented in these textbooks to prepare German students. And she acknowledges that textbooks are just one perspective into classroom practices, but I think textbooks exert a major influence on how English is taught and the way students view and see the language. So her results found that there was an overrepresentation of UK target users and cultures. So often in the textbooks, there were activities like write a postcard to your host family in London, or help American tourists in Berlin find their way to the museum. So always the cultures were about using English with people from native English speaking countries. And she found across all of the textbooks, there was just only one example where students had a task where the German students had to apply for a job and write a cover letter to apply for a job in France. And so that was the only one example where students were told to imagine that they were going to be using English to communicate with another, non-English speaking European country. And so that we found was quite surprising. What we also see, one of the third proposals of change is raising awareness of global Englishes. And so this here is about talking to students directly about how English is used. And so we have a problem here where traditional depictions of native speaker as ideal have the effect of the learner feeling deficient. So if we are talking about, if we kind of only introduce or talk about English in terms of native speakers, it can kind of create an insider-outsider terminology where English is seen to only belong to England or only belong to the UK. And some messages, and here's one from the British Council from about 10 years ago. And to be fair to the British Council, this is no longer on their website. But I think it still illustrates the kind of messages that a lot of countries will use to try to commercialize English language teaching. And so they say the UK attracts international students every year, and over 600,000 learners come each year to use the language in its natural home. And so here we see some messaging that, the British Council is saying that the UK is the natural home of English, and it's where you have to come to kind of learn the real English in its real natural setting. So what Global English is, will argue for to kind of really challenge this idea, the way that students think about language, and actually teach direct issues surrounding global Englishes in terms of teaching students about global usage, so how it's used around the world, about who English belongs to, and about standard language ideology. And standard language ideology means the kind of beliefs that people have, both students and teachers have, about what is correct or incorrect English, or what is the desirable or undesirable English. And so Nicola Galloway has done quite a lot of work in Japan on this, where she raised awareness of global Englishes to students at the university level, and she saw an increase in confidence in the students' self-perception as users of English. Bunsuk, Mbele, and McKinley also report similar findings in Thailand, where they used global English's awareness raising in Thailand and found quite similar results in terms of kind of raising students' confidence and perceptions as English language users, as a result of directly communicating with them the kind of how English is used globally today. One of the examples that I've done with Nicola is engage students in a debate and discussion about Singaporean English. And one of the reasons I chose Singaporean English is it's a really interesting case study for students, because in Singapore, they have this ongoing movement that's been going for about 20 years now, called the Speak Good English movement. And it's by the Speak Good English movement organization that is encouraging Singaporean people to not use Singaporean English or Singlish, and to try to speak a more, what they would say, understandable variety of English, or a standard variety. What's good about the Speak Good English movement is there's lots of information online, lots of debate. There are videos on YouTube of presentations. There are promotional videos on YouTube as well. And so students can use these to kind of engage in discussion and debate about this particular issue. And it can be quite interesting that through discussion and debate, students start to think, more deeply about, well, what is correct English? What is correct English? Why are varieties like Singaporean English viewed by some as not correct? And so here we can see the students engaged in a debate and discussion about that after having done research with those online resources. So we're also seeing a lot of recent research come out of this. And so I've listed 3 different studies here. So one was done in Taiwan, where they engaged Taiwanese students with an online activity with students from Indonesia. And it was, intended to kind of expose their ideas about how English is used as a lingua franca. Another one also used video conference embedded classroom, so engaged Japanese university students with video conferencing with other students around the world to engage them with these notions of English as an international language. And also another one used a digital innovation in South Korea, and saw that kind of exposing them to ideas about global English's enhanced positive attitudes. And so what I see then is there seem to be some implications for digital learning here, that we're seeing a lot more online materials, really good YouTube videos about different varieties of English, different accents, that can be quite useful resources about the English language. So not only Speak Good English movement, but other resources. And we're seeing a lot of tele-collaboration as well. So connecting students in different countries with different first languages to engage in projects and tasks to help students engage in real English as a lingua franca practice. And so here's an example of other online media. So there are, this is a MOOC that has been developed around global Englishes through the University of Tokyo with my colleague Nicola Galloway is there presenting. So then this kind of feeds into this 4th point, which is about raising awareness of English as a lingua franca strategies. And so one of the problems with traditional, the way strategies are taught is it tends to focus on being understood by a native speaker. So, you know, it's about how do you make yourself understood by a native speaker? And usually it means that you have to become more like the native speaker to do this. And so here's a photo here from a book that says a native speaker would say it like this. So it's about developing the strategies to sound more native. Global Englishers would say that we need to have a wider range of strategies. And I've mentioned this before, you know, you need strategies to communicate with people of greater or lower proficiency, or of different accents, or different norms or types of English that come from different communities with different practices. And we can kind of see this message kind of emerge in popular media too. So here's actually from more than 10 years ago now, we can see this message in a Japanese newspaper saying, English is a lingua franca, forget the native speaker model, make yourself understood. So it's making yourself understood, making sure communication is successful. That's the most important thing. Probably one of the best studies that I've seen that does this is by Paula Vetterol. So she did an activity with other colleagues in Italy, Poland, Latvia, and Slovakia, where more than 500 children engaged in a project where they had to communicate online via written and spoken communication and complete this project together. And so I think these kinds of activities not only have good value for the learners, but they helped students develop strategies. So as they had to communicate to complete this project, they had to naturally develop strategies to make sure that they could communicate successfully and be understood. And I think we need to see more activities like that. And so I could imagine in, you know, Thailand, you could do something quite similar, where you have students engage with university students in Vietnam, in you know, other neighboring countries in China to complete projects together and kind of use English as a lingua franca in a kind of more natural setting. But of course, English as a lingua franca is not about everything's okay. You have your English, I have my English, you know, everything is okay. That's not the central story, right? The central story is intelligibility is key, that you need to be able to communicate, you need to be able to be understood by each other. And so intelligibility is key to good ELF communication and therefore good teaching. And so, you know, we don't need to sound like a native speaker, but we do need to be intelligible. We do need to be understood. And so we need to find the right balance there. And so I've mentioned that study by Paula Vetterol. The other one that I mentioned about Taiwan and Indonesia was something quite similar, where the Indonesian students in that study had lower language proficiency. And so another finding was reported that they needed to communicate successfully. Okay, I'm going to skip that slide and go on to changing teacher hiring practices. So this is a big one. And so what we see is in traditional English language teaching, we see job advertisements like this around the country, where in Poland, native speaker of English with neutral accent wanted. Okay, in Japan, native English speaker and university degree required, education preferred. So it's the idea that you can have a degree in science or chemistry or anything, it doesn't matter, okay? As long as you're an English native speaker, that's the most important thing. In China, native English speakers with neutral native dialect. So this notion that even all native speakers aren't equal, actually they want somebody with a more neutral accent. And so Ali says on a global level, the ELT profession is perhaps the world's only occupation in which the majority faces discrimination. And what's meant by this is that if we look at all of the English language teachers around the world, it's estimated that at least 80% of English language teachers are so-called non-native English speaking teachers. So they are the majority, but it seems like they are facing discrimination in terms of access to jobs because of that status. And so sometimes it can be more implicit. So here's a job advertisement for a commercial English language school in Japan. and they say, please apply online. And then they say you can apply in Canada, you can apply in the US, apply in the UK, apply in Australia and New Zealand. And so the main message here is basically, we only, the school is saying, we only want teachers from these countries. And then we can see this a lot in different books as well, where the focus is really on, the kind of native English speaker being the kind of best teacher because they will speak native English, which is the best. And so we see lots of books like this about, speak like a native speaker, common mistakes by non-native speakers of English. And so what we see then is a kind of consequence where we are positioning people as non-native English speakers, which I think is really damaging to the community because it kind of creates a separation between those that speak English based on nativeness, so whether they're native or non-native, and not about actually how good they are at the language, how much they know the language, how good they are at teaching. So probably these qualities are far more important than whether you can just be labeled a native or non-native speaker. And so what we've seen now is we see some research come out of that analyze discrimination in job advertisements. Sorry, this table is a little bit difficult to understand, but what's most interesting here is the kind of discrimination that's based on nativeness as a job requirement. And so what this study found was 60% of job advertisements looked at had some discrimination about whether they wanted a native speaker or not. And that was the biggest criteria for the jobs, and in terms of whether you were eligible for this job or not, not whether you had a teaching degree or something else. And they also found that discrimination often occurs more in EFL settings, so English as a foreign language setting, compared to ESL settings. So those that were maybe teaching English as a second language to people in America or Australia, that discrimination was less, that it was these EFL settings that discrimination was biggest. So that's places like Japan or places like Thailand. And another study here that looked at 77 job ads in Asia found also that nativeness was one of the biggest areas, criteria that job advertisements were looking for. So we see a lot of discrimination. What we then need is a change in English teacher hiring practices. So a global English approach sees a need for hiring based on qualifications. So we need to re-examine the concept of qualified teachers. Kirkpatrick says we need to have expert users as role models. And this is what I said before, that actually multilingual English teachers are probably the best role models for students, because they are people who have studied and mastered the language and can be really positive role models, as opposed to a monolingual English teacher that has not, mastered any language. So I would also argue that non-native English speaking teachers of different first language add an element of authenticity. So for example, the moment that you have, a teacher from Malaysia go into a Thai classroom, or a teacher from the Philippines go into a English language classroom in Thailand, we are automatically introducing an authentic English as a lingua franca situation, where English will be the common language for students to communicate with the teachers. And so I think then, if we can kind of open up more mobility for teachers, we can see the large talent pool, about 80% of teachers being able to travel more internationally and kind of use, English and teach English on an international platform. What we're seeing, though, actually is quite recently some changes and challenges to this. I find what's happening in the Philippines quite interesting, that we're seeing new online spaces that break down traditional barriers to non-native English-speaking teacher mobility. So a lot of Japanese students, Korean students are learning English online now with teachers in the Philippines. Of course, there are some problems with this. There's still a lot of marketization of the kind of native English speaker, But I think this is kind of at least challenging this notion that you don't have to, have a teacher from Australia or the US to learn English. But actually, especially the Philippines, where English is used as a, by many people as a native language alongside other languages, it's a, a really important English teaching context, especially for places in Southeast Asia. And we're seeing that Anglophone dominance also in study abroad domain has been challenged. So what we're seeing is a lot of universities offering more international programs, and so attracting kind of international students. So you'll see more students, come to places like Thailand to do a degree through English. And I think this has helped kind of create new spaces for teachers. Okay. What we have also then is future innovation. So what does this mean in terms of putting proposals into practice? So what we see then is we need a kind of a change in English language teaching. We need a change in classroom practices, a change in publication industry for who makes textbooks, and a change in the job market. So this is a big task. So we have to think, well, where do we start with this? One of the frameworks we've developed to kind of help innovate or change English language teaching is the Global English's Language Teaching Framework, which is here. And it has a number of dimensions in terms of target interlocutor. This means who are we speaking English with? So we need to kind of change the perception that it's not just about native English speakers, it's about all English users to truly be global. We need to change ideas about ownership, that it's not, an inner circle would be American or Australian or British English to kind of global. We need to change our perceptions of the cultures of English. We need to change our perceptions of what's the kind of normal type of English being used. Change our perceptions of teachers. So who is, that we want qualified, competent teachers. We need to change our perception of who are the role models, that we want kind of expert users as role models, not native English speakers. Change our perception of how we view our first language and our own culture, about how needs are defined, about how we assess English is important, about the different goals of learning and how we think about English. And so there's a lot of information here that's probably more useful for those that are trying to work in teacher education or to research global Englishes. But the main message is we need to really look at all of the different dimensions of English language teaching and try to think of ways that we can innovate and change. But of course, this change is not always easy. There's going to be a lot of barriers that will prevent us from making big changes in the classroom. So for example, there's a lack of materials. So it's very hard to teach in a global English's way if you have only access to these kind of traditional textbooks, right? That teachers are very busy. They can't be expected to, create, new materials just for these kind of new approaches. Language assessment is a really big barrier, that if you're teaching in a classroom and your students have to pass a kind of English language test that's based on standard English, then that's going to be a barrier to change, because obviously you want your students to do well, so you have to teach some notions of standard English. Teacher education and training can be a barrier, that a lot of teachers will continue with the same practices that they used when they learned English, and that kind of new ways to teach English as a global language might not necessarily be taught. They might not have the knowledge. There's an attachment to standard English by managers, by parents, by teachers and students, that these kind of deeply felt beliefs that, American English is the best, or that UK English is the only correct English, that these kinds of beliefs, this attachment to standards, is quite difficult to challenge and change. And then, of course, there are teacher recruitment practices. So we can't deny that often for many schools, the native speaker is a selling point, and it's used for selling, different courses or for advertising different courses. And so it can be quite a barrier to change. So then also what we then find is that a lot of Global English's work is what would be described as a grassroots movement. And so grassroots means that often it is happening with little small changes in the classroom done by teachers themselves, rather than any top-down educational policy. And so some teachers then are just looking at their curriculum and thinking, can small changes be implemented? Because sometimes even small changes can have a big impact. So for example, teachers could look at needs analysis. So needs analysis is essential for teaching and developing a curriculum. So they could ask themselves, will students need to use English as a lingua franca? And if so, then how do we match those needs? They could look at the goals and objectives. So do the goals of the curriculum meet the needs of the students to use English as a global language? And if not, how can we change these? They could look at the syllabus and ask, does the syllabus include Global English's elements, such as exposure or awareness raising or strategy training? And if not, can these be implemented? They could look at the different methods that they use and see, are they appropriate to Global English as a language teaching? They could look at assessment and look at, well, are we assessing students in line with authentic ways that English is used outside of the classroom? And then also constantly evaluating the curriculum against benchmarks of global use. And so what we then need is to see kind of innovation happen from these grassroots efforts. So innovation is often occurs in small incremental steps. And this is not just in education, but also in business. Whenever we want to innovate, basically things take time for something to become more popular or mainstream. And so I think Global English's language teaching is something quite similar to this, that what we see is, so what we see is the yellow line here is the kind of people taking on new ideas or innovations, and it takes time. So what we see now is probably Global English is still at this very early stage, that we only see a very small pool of teachers kind of innovating and making changes in the classroom. But what happens then, hopefully, is that the more that teachers are kind of innovating and reporting and talking to other teachers about change, that we might start to see kind of early adopters. So a kind of larger percentage of teachers incorporating Global Englishes or global approaches to their language teaching. And then, it might never become mainstream. It might, we might never see that rapid growth. But I think these innovators are really, really important to instigating change. And so we would say then a lot so far that we've looked at with Global Englishes have been reports on single activities that have happened in the classroom. And so my studies would be like that, like my listening journal study or my presentation study. They're about doing one activity in the classroom and reporting on it. And so I think that these single activities are important, but they might not result in kind of massive change because they're just kind of one task. So what we see now, what we see a need for now is kind of bigger studies and studies that really look at the impact of Global Englishes over time and see, well, how do these innovations really change students' perceptions about learning English, students' identity, if at all, right? We don't have that information yet about how effective Global English's approaches are. At the moment, we're still in that very kind of innovative idea stage. And so for those of you in the audience that might be interested in researching Global Englishes, there are some available methods here. We see action research, which looks at teachers reporting on practices towards achieving a goal. We see some kind of intervention studies where you might want to have some kind of Global Englishes curriculum, and you're looking at the effect of that curriculum, before and after it's implemented. we see some other types of research, qualitative research as well, that could be quite interesting. But I think these two are really where the future is in terms of gathering the information we need about whether global English as language teaching is effective or not. 2 years ago, I did a review of different research on global Englishes, and an example here in the red are that actually few studies were what's termed longitudinal studies. So this means few of them were studies that explored the effect of global Englishes over a long period of time. And so I think also these are the kinds of studies that we need to see in the future. Okay, so actually I'm finished there now, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Heath. Now I think we do have one question in the chat and perhaps one comment. So well, it's a long one, so perhaps you could read it. Yeah, it's a long one.
Let me have a look.
Yeah.
So someone says, as a language teacher, not only English, but any language, shouldn't we set this ultimate goal? That is to enable our student to use the standard variety or variety nearest to the standard variety of language. It does not mean any native speakers variety, but standardized variety that has been codified. Yeah, so I think this is important. Like, I'm not saying that we need to throw away, kind of standard English, that's not important anymore. I think for some students that will be important. But I think I'm saying it can't just be that standard, right? If we just teach that standard, then we're not preparing students to use it as a global language. And I guess I'm emphasizing too that while that might be the ultimate goal, we have to realize most students will not get there, right? And that's okay. If they can get, they can move towards it, but as long as they're functional and can communicate in the language, that's important. So actually, Aya Matsuda who's a researcher of World Englishes, has looked at this about, if we don't choose American English or British English, what is the standard? Actually, we do need some kind of, standard to assess and to teach. But I would agree with Amara here that it could be some other, if you decide that there's another more suitable variety that could serve as a standard, then certainly you could use that. And I think this is where it's kind of, as you say, it's been codified. I think that helps. I think one of the problems with saying English as a lingua franca as a standard is that it has not been codified. Actually, there's no such thing as, a standard English as a lingua franca. So it's not suitable, as a kind of assessment standard. So we do need to look at other places. It's a very thoughtful question there from Amara. Thank you. Next one says, ELF should concern attitudes and awareness of a large amount of variation of English speaking around the world, not only teaching or learning for high proficiency. I hope all of you here are still aware good English is...
Even though you may not use it.
Okay. Okay, so just arguing that good English is important, I think they're saying, right? Yeah, and I think this is where I would emphasize this again, that English as a lingua franca is not about everything is okay. That is not the message of English as a lingua franca. It's actually, everything is not okay. What's important is that you can be understood. And for you to be understood, you might need to adhere to certain standards that people are familiar with. But it's just about flexibility. So yes, certainly not saying that anything is okay. And even Jennifer Jenkins, who's written a lot about English as a lingua franca, says this message multiple times. English as a lingua franca is not saying anything goes, anything is okay. Okay. Or more long questions or comments. Sorry, I'm just reading the next one. You mentioned international programs like EFL. These programs offer opportunities for local teachers to teach content in English. when it comes to English classes of those international programs for engineering presentation skills, some programs make it clear in their policy that these classes must be taught by native English speaking teachers. Wow, it might be because all EMI classes are taught by Thai professors. To make the program look international, that require only English teachers to teach English classes. What do I think of that situation?
How compromise? Very interesting question.
That's a very interesting question. In terms of what do I think about this situation, I think it's terrible, if I'm to be honest. That I think the right EMI professor is somebody who knows the subject area, right? Who knows, for example, engineering or whatever the subject area is, and is competent enough in English to teach that subject area in English. And I think as long as you find somebody that meets that criteria, then they will be a good EMI professor for an international program. I think it's quite appalling to say that you have to hire a native English speaker to meet international standards, because this is totally not true, right? If you go to an engineering class lecture in Oxford, you will probably find the professor is from Germany, is from China, is from Turkey, is from all of these different countries. And, you know, can we say that's not meeting the international standard because they're not native English speaking teachers? No. I think as long as you know the subject area and have competence in English, then you should be qualified to teach those programs. How do you compromise? I don't know. I think you have to really have deep conversations and kind of challenge policies like that, because I think they come from a very problematic source of justification. Yeah.
Right. So I think it's on Multiple has more comments on this. Yep. Right. Yes. Yeah. And you. Yeah.
Great. If they may ask you live, because I wanted to give more comments on my question. Yep. For EMI classes, is fine that local teachers teach EMI classes because, you know, it's about content, right? Engineering, chemistry. So I think all of the courses are taught by Thai teachers. Okay. But when it comes to English classes for that international program, yeah, they require only native speaker teachers because, you know, to make it look international, you should have some international teachers as well, right, in the program. Okay, and actually, only few programs mention this. Is good that, you know, most of the programs they are okay with Thai teachers teaching English classes for those international programs. Okay. So yeah, so that's
so it's mainly about the English classes.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is where we talk about this kind of notion, the barrier that I mentioned at the end, right? That is the native speaker sells, right? It's a kind of selling point. And so it sounds like maybe some of these universities are using the native speaker as a kind of selling point to say, look, our programs are international because we have only native English speakers that teach, you know, on the English language program. So I guess I would argue I would argue against that kind of practice. Once again, to say, you know, somebody that is competent should be a competent teacher of English and knows English to the level to ensure students are learning English to be able to study engineering. I don't think nativeness matters. You know, that shouldn't be a criteria. So I think that's, you know, but I totally understand your point that I think this is the barrier. Native speaker is a selling point, and it's going to be very hard to kind of challenge that.
Yeah, because it's about the attitude of maybe the parents as well, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, oh, I sent my kids to this international program and all the teachers are Thais, right? So the easiest way out is to invite native speaker teachers to teach English classes. Yeah.
So I don't have a solution for that, because I think this is a kind of top-down policy, you know, that needs to change, and that's going to be much harder to change. I think that's why at the end I was saying a lot of the changes I'm talking about are quite grassroots, so they're people making smaller changes. But I think you know, that kind of situation will be much more difficult to change because it requires some deep conversations with people that are making the policies that might be more worried about, you know, attracting students and things like finances and money more than, you know, quality of education. Yeah. But thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. Yeah, the next question, it's quite linguistic, I guess. It's a long one too.
My name is Smith. My question might not be specifically English so far. So at the beginning of the speech, language changes when in contact with other language. Old English contains gender of noun-like characteristics, which fall into one of three categories. Yes. Yes. What influences this change? Why did these articles eventually become the article the? And given the fact that the present globalization tendency is pretty obvious, the chance that things may shift again, despite the fact that we have dictionaries or lectures that attempt to establish English roles. First part, I would need to go back and study the reasons for that change. But I think I'm just trying to think, because there was massive influence after Old English of French. And so we need to really understand what changed then between Old English in contact with French that made English lose its gender features, right? Because English is not a gendered language like some other languages are. I need to understand more about why that change happened. So I can't answer that, but I'm sure you can maybe have that. I'm sure you can find the answer if we investigate it a little bit more. But it had something to do with contact. What influences this change? So you know, it must have had something to do with the kind of sociolinguistic contact at that time. And same with the word the. Okay, I don't know enough. But the next one I can talk to, right? Yeah. Given the fact that the present globalization tendency is pretty obvious, I'm curious there's a chance that things may shift again, despite the fact that we have dictionaries or lectures that attempt to establish English rules. Yeah. So one of the aspects I didn't get into in that part of the talk is that what happened between 900 and 1400 was very unique in that during that time, French was in the prestige position in the UK. Like French was the seen as the kind of valuable higher language in society. It was used like in the courts and in nobility by, you know, the king and queen. And English was in the kind of non-prestige position or non-powerful position. And so that means that English was the one that changed a lot. What we see now with globalization is the opposite, right? That English is in the prestige position. It's seen as a kind of valuable language in the world, right? People want to learn English because they think it's going to get them better jobs. It's going to, you know, allow them to, you know, earn more money, access different parts of the world, be more mobile. And so I think the kind of influence of other languages on English is not as great as previously. So it's probably less likely to kind of change drastically, but it is changing little by little, right? That's why we're always updating dictionaries every year. So it is changing little by little. It does have an effect. So I don't think we'll see that change again. And one of the other reasons is that from 1400 to now, we've seen the invention of the printing press, of mass literacy, that we see written standards. And so now that we kind of have kind of written language and written artifacts that, you know, and high literacy rates in the population, that everybody kind of has a more access to the kind of standard written language. And so I think in the modern world now that we are writing English and we are writing in language and we have access to resources globally, and there is this kind of standard written language, I don't think spoken language will ever deviate drastically from that. And so I think what we'll see then is any changes once again being quite small. you know, they might just be at the level of vocabulary, you know, even spoken sound might change, but we're not going to see those big changes to grammar and syntax as much anymore. So I think, yeah, I don't think that shift will happen again unless something globally happens that's huge. And then in terms of dictionaries, to establish English rules, like, yeah. So once we saw the invention of the printing press and dictionaries, I think this really helped kind of slow down, you know, change in language. But that being said, dictionaries are based on common usage. And so every year, you know, even, you know, the Oxford English Language Dictionary will update every year based on a corpus of language of how it's used. And so if different language changes in terms of how it's used, it usually gets added to the dictionary. So, but I think these changes will be small and slow and not big, like we've seen in the past. So I hope that answered your question.
Right. So I think we can do 2 more questions and we can round things up. Yeah.
I can talk about, can you please differentiate global English as English as an international language? I can answer that simply to say no. I think, sorry, my simple answer is no. My longer answer is, I think different people will use the terms in the same way. And so if I talk about global Englishes and I have another scholar like Aya Matsuda or Ali Fawad Selvi talking about English as an international language, we're actually talking about exactly the same thing. We're just using different words because they kind of come from different areas. And so I don't really make a differentiation between the two. You know, maybe global Englishes might draw more on world Englishes because it kind of comes on from that perspective, but in reality, actually, people often use the same terms to talk about different terms to talk about the same thing. So I wouldn't make a distinction between the two. You know, some of the research I mentioned uses the term English as an international language, and it's talking about the same thing. Okay. Could you share the PowerPoint slides with us? Well, I think this is recorded, right?
It is recorded, so you can go back and watch the video.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share them with. I'll share them with you.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
I don't. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. In Thailand, they would spend a lot. Yeah, okay. Just a comment there, in Thailand, they would spend a large budget for native teachers. Yeah, I think we see this in a lot of different countries, and this is where the kind of native speaker sells it once again. Great. Okay, there's one last question.
Yeah, last question.
I teach English pronunciation course for college English major students. I wonder if I should use some non-authentic, non-English speakers speaking English materials in my pronunciation classes. I'm worried if they would then speak English with a variety of accents, if general English is better for courses such as English listening. Great question. Great question. I think here, this is where we see, and I've done some work in intelligibility, right? And I think there is a difference between when we're teaching students about things like pronunciation, right? When we're teaching students pronunciation, that is how they are speaking English, you know, our goal is we want our students to be understood by as many people as possible, right? So when it comes to speaking English, I think there's probably more of an argument for them to kind of not copy or mimic, but to kind of adhere to some kind of more widely understood standard, right? So if there are some features of Thai English that might make students difficult to be understood by other speakers, then we need to address those, right? And so I think we can speak more to I think it's more important for them to kind of speak closer to a standard. It doesn't mean copying an American accent, right? But it just means, not speaking in ways that will make sure it's difficult for them to understand. So that's when it comes to speaking. When it comes to listening, once again, our goal is we want students to be able to understand a wide variety of speakers around the world. And so for listening, I think the argument is stronger to expose them to a wide range of accents, because it will help them get accustomed to understanding, not all English is the same, there are lots of different accents, and I need to adjust my listening abilities to understand them. So I think there's a difference for pronunciation in terms of how we're teaching students to speak, because we want them to be understood, and listening, where we want them to understand a wide variety. So I think that kind of variation is much more important with listening than with speaking. So hopefully that makes sense. That's a great question.
All right. Yes, thank you. I think, yes, no more questions, right? So,
Great.
Right. So I would like to thank Heath for a very insightful talk. I'm sure we have learned a lot from you today, and we are really excited, to see you here again and talking about global Englishes and things like that. Okay, so please give Heath a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, you have a nice evening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you again sometimes in the future. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, and Guang is still
here.
All right, so I stopped recording. So
okay.